The only tradition of philosophy that is able to produce philosophy is the Western tradition. They won't say Western man tradition, we'll say the Western tradition. And that's philosophy. The other is folklore, culture, religion. That's not philosophy, it's particularistic. It's only this other tradition is able to produce universality. Okay? So you have here, some beings in the world that are universal, other beings that are particularistic. And it happened that, 6% of humanity are the universals. 94% are not universals, they're particularistic. Okay? You get me? So there's something wrong here, fundamentally wrong here, I would say, in this kind of structure. Okay? There's something fundamentally wrong that we need to rethink and change in the way we are thinking of knowledge production. Because then the problem is then that it becomes, I would call it a Eurocentric fundamentalism, this epistemic sexism, racism, because it poses itself as, I call fundamental anybody who thinks that their epistemology is superior to everybody else. Okay? It doesn't matter which tradition. Anybody who says, my epistemology is superior to everybody else, that's a fundamentalist. Okay? And everybody's inferior to me. That's a fundamentalism. Now, Eurocentric fundamentalism, we never call it Eurocentric fundamentalism. It's so normative, it's so commonsensical. We don't call it this way. You see? Do you know how many social scientists, just to stay in the terrain of social science, are out there, okay, in the rest of the world, producing knowledge, okay, and critical knowledge, scientific knowledge, based on other social historical experience that are not part of the conversation, are completely out of the conversation, just because you have this structure of epistemic racism, sexism installed here that do not allow to bring those other thinkers, okay, women, male thinkers, critical thinkers, into the conversation. Okay? They're completely out. So now, coming after giving this context, I think it's necessary to give this context. Otherwise, you start talking about things, and people might say, "Oh, well, what are you talking about? Why are you saying this?" Okay, well, now you know why I'm saying this. Okay, you don't have to agree. Okay, you don't have to agree, but at least you know where I'm coming from. Let me put it here. So here you have the line of the human. Okay? Or what Boaventura Sosa Santos called the abyssal line. Okay? The abyssal line. Boaventura says that modernity is constructed through this abyssal line. And I mean, you probably have read this or are in process of reading this material because he's talking about the Treaty of Tordesillas, thank you. That was the treaty between Portugal and Spain with the Vatican, dividing. It was a line about, it was a zone of law and a zone of lawlessness. Okay, and that was, but the point is the following. The line of the human. So above the line you have people who happen to be the superior universal beings, etc. No? And then inferior people here, below the line. Above the line you have superior equal and what? Human. They are the people recognized as human. Below the line, people whose humanity is in question. So you have the subhuman and the non-human. And these differences are important because they're in the imperial colonial projects, they have developed this sub and non to divide and rule. So you put one a little bit on top of this and make him believe that he's closer to here, even though from here this look below. You see? It's called divide and rule. Okay? But the point is, you have now what Fanon calls zone of being, and here what Fanon calls zone of non-being. Why is he using being non-being? He's saying the people who happen to be above the line, their social existence, their spirituality, their ways of being, of living, their forms of thinking, forms of economy, or forms of political authority, etc., are considered superior, okay, to the forms of thinking, being, existing, etc., of the people living below the line. So he's talking about a broad area of social existence, human social existence, that is not just Color. Color is a fundamental marker. It's a fundamental marker of this. So color is one way in which you can mark superiority, inferiority, but it's not the only one. You could have religion, look at the debates today in Europe about Muslims, okay? Islamophobia today in Europe is pretty much along this line. And I will call it a form of racism because, it's a way of marking superiority, inferiority along the line of the human. And these people are savages, these people are barbarians, these people are violent, and so on. Now, this zone is heterogeneous. This is not a homogeneous zone, okay? In this zone, you have the dialectics of I and other, okay? You have the dialectics of I and other here in this zone. So I don't want to say that the people living in the zone of being are living in a homogeneous zone. That zone is very heterogeneous, okay? Now, in this zone, in the dialectics of I and other, the other is an oppressed other. Because in this zone, there is class oppression, gender oppression, sexual oppression, and many other forms of oppression. In the zone of being, in this zone, despite the intersectionality of the oppressions, they live racial privilege. They live racial privilege here. That's what is common to the zone. Okay? People living below the line of the human, they are also pressed along class line, gender line, sexual line, all kind of lines, but aggravated by racial oppression. Okay? So they live class oppression here, gender oppression here, gender oppression here, sexual oppression here. But there is a qualitative difference in the way these oppressions are lived in these zones. Because in this zone there is racial privilege, and in this zone there is racial oppression. So with racial oppression, it aggravates the other intersectional forms of oppressions. What do I mean by aggravate? This word aggravate, underlining, okay? And what I mean here is what Boaventura Sosa Santos called, and this is very important for the discussion, he's saying that in this zone you have the way the system manages the conflicts of class, gender, sexuality, etc., is through forms of regulation and emancipation. Regulation in the sense of codes of law that are applied to these people in this zone. Okay? Codes of law. And emancipatory enlightenment discourses, such as autonomy, freedom, liberty, etc. Okay? Equality, and so on. Okay? So, as a rule, you have peaceful means of managing conflicts here. That's why they get access to human rights, women's rights, labor rights, because their humanity is recognized by this eye. This is the imperial, patriarchal, capitalist eye. Okay? And they oppress others in the zone of being, but in that oppression, because they recognize the humanity of the other, then what happens is that you have forms of managing the conflicts that is different than what happened here. Here, what you have is violence and appropriation as a form of managing conflicts. Okay? So you have violence and appropriation. So even though you have class oppression here, class oppression there, they are lived differently. And I'm going to give a few examples. Give me 5 minutes. I'm coming back. Okay, is everybody here? Or can we continue? There are a few people missing. So here, the way the system manages conflicts is through violence and appropriation. I can give you a few examples that maybe a lot of you have already heard. Like, you could take class oppression. Okay? Part of what happened with Eurocentrism is that they fall into the traps of universal abstracts. And universal abstract means you do transhistorical, you take concepts and make them transhistorical. So you say racism, and racism have been there since Adam and Eve. You say slavery and racism, slavery have been there since Adam and Eve. You dehistoricize. You throw history out and make it into some kind of eternal structure. Okay? And the same thing happens when you talk about these things. You think, okay, this is a proletariat exploited in the zone of being, and this is a proletariat exploited too. So we're talking about the same thing, right? Well, it's not the same thing. Because if you could take example, for example, a worker in an Airbus company, okay, working 8 hours a day, earning 150 euros an hour, okay, or you have a worker working 14 hours a day in a maquiladora, okay? In a maquiladora, I mean sweatshops in cities inside in the north, okay, in the global north, or in maquiladoras in the global south, usually women, 90% women of color, okay, in those maquiladoras, that's not accidental, earning $2, $3, $4 a day or things like that, okay, very low salaries, working 14, 16 hour days, okay. I'm sorry, but that's not the same. You cannot use, you could do a formality and say, well, they are all proletarians, and they are all class exploited. But that's a formality, because in fact, they're living very different things. Because if this worker mobilized against the Airbus company, okay, and tried to, in the mobilization against the Airbus company, try to fight the owner of the company, either with a demonstration or organizing a union or going to a court, okay? They know that their life is not at stake. They know that their life is not at stake. But if a woman in a maquiladora in northern Mexico or in other parts of the world try to organize a union or do a demonstration, they know they're risking their life. Because conflicts are organized very differently, are managed very differently if you are in the zone of being or zone of non-being. If your humanity is recognized, then the system will manage the conflict in a way, okay, in which your rights, okay, will be acknowledged, and you could use those rights to fight back, and emancipatory discourses, autonomy, freedom, liberty, equality, etc. But here, because the humanity of these people are not recognized, the way the system manages conflict is through violence and constant appropriation, with exceptional moments of peace. The same thing in the other way. Peace with exceptional moments of violence. It's not that there's zero violence here, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that as a trend, the way the system manages conflict here is through more peaceful means, okay, with exceptional moments of violence. And here is the opposite. The system manages conflict through violence, through authoritarianism, without recognizing rights, without recognizing the humanity of the other, and therefore they use violence and appropriation. Now here is where we go to, basically landing into the topic of today. And that is, what are the epistemological implications of this history I told you and this structure? This structure is global and is national, because you have zones of being, non-being, in terms of the north-south divide at a global scale, but you have zones of being, non-being inside Brazil, inside Germany, inside France, inside each different nation states around the world. And even locally, you could find zones of being, non-being. So it is a structure goes from the global to the local. There is a north-south divide at a global scale, but there is a south inside the north, and there is a north inside the south. So when I say zone of being, non-being, this is what I call the West, okay? And this is what I will call the rest, okay? This is the structure, quintessential structure of domination and racism in the world we live. Because depending where you're located here will depend how much you earn, what will you do in the international division of labor, how much you earn for what you do. So this structure is not a superstructure. It's constitutive of the way capital accumulation operates at a world scale. And so the point I'm trying to say here is that the West is not a geography. This is a very typical reading of what I'm saying. It's not a geography, it's a positionality in racial ethnic hierarchies, in power structures. It's not a geography. Because, again, there is south-north, okay, and you could look at this zone of being, non-being in terms of in the global scale, the north and the south, but you could see this also as zone of being, non-being inside nation states in the north, because there is a south inside the north, what we call in the US people of color, okay? But there's also a north inside the south that are part of the West. There are westernized elites produced by this same westernized university that are the intermediaries at a global scale, you see, in the third world, westernized elite in the third world, that are going to be located in the zone of being in the third world. And you could have, and this is where people get confused, they collapse racism with color and lose sight of the multiplicity of ways in which racism operates. Because you could have westernized elites in Africa today, color skin black, and they belong to the westernized elites in that zone of the world. They are in the zone of being, in that zone of the world. Because they are the ones who have been socialized in westernized thinking and are the ones reproducing or producing the policies that are going to fit into the north-south divide. And they are the intermediaries between the local population in the zone of non-being and the northern financial capital or transnational corporations. And I call them westernized elites. You see, because, and here is what I'm saying, the question is not necessarily color, because in the case of Africa, these westernized elites have the same color skin of the people of the population. So how do they do the marker of the West and the rest there? They do it through epistemology, they do it through ethnicity, and through religion, depending on which part of Africa you are. And in the case of the Americas, color becomes a fundamental structure because you have the westernized white Creole elites running the nation states in Latin America, Central America, and North America. You see? In other parts of the world, like India, you have the Hindi westernized elites, okay, exercising a colonial power over the other groups inside India. So, I don't want to represent here a binary model, because it's no binary model here. If you look at this from the global to the local, it becomes very complex. Because the structures of racism that I'm naming here this way, zone of being, non-being, following Fanon, you could find it not only at the global scale, but also inside nation state and inside even local spaces, communities, etc. Because this is a structure that was put in place with the European colonial expansion, and the European colonial expansion touched everybody in the world. By the late 19th century, all countries in the world were either colonized or peripheralized by the West. There was not a single country that was not peripheralized or colonized by the West. And so everybody has been touched by this. Okay? Nobody can claim, oh, you know what, I'm outside of that history, it has nothing to do with me. No. Everybody has been touched with this, and therefore racism, if it was a Western problem in the 16th century, today is a world problem. It's not a European or Western problem. It's a world problem. Because these are the structures that are put in place, okay, worldwide. And nobody can say, you know, I'm outside that history. I wash my hands from that, that's the European problem. No, that's a problem everywhere. Okay? And what we need to pay attention to is that not to collapse this structure with the particular form it acquires in different places. If it acquires color as the marker, you see, or religion as the marker, other markers, doesn't mean that we collapse the definition of racism with a particular manifestation, you see. What I'm trying to say is that we need to disentangle the particular historical manifestation in which racism is marked in different local colonial history from the definition of racism itself. This is what I'm trying to say. To keep the definition is not, oh, racism is a structure of white and non-whites. This is usually the way, or racism is a structure about scientific racism in which you have biological superior people in biological inferior people. That might be one particular form of marking racism, but it's not the only one, okay? It's not the only one. And that we need to keep an eye open to the different ways in which this has been articulated. And sometimes in overlapping way and complex ways. Sometimes you have, religious racism overlap with color racism in very complex ways. And so you need to look at this history in concrete in different parts of the world. You cannot a priori say, oh, it's this way or that way. So for me, racism is not color racism or religious racism or ethnic racism. Racism is a structure, superiority, inferiority, along the line of the human. It's an institutional power structure. Racism is always institutional. It's never some kind of individual prejudice. No? It's not an individual prejudice. It's institutional, always. Okay? You could have a prejudice in your head about anybody, about other people. That doesn't mean it's going to affect the life of people. It affects the life of people when you have institutions putting in place, okay, a structure of power that is going to dehumanize and inferiorize the populations. And that's when then you get social effects. You either have mass killing of people, or you have repression, or you have segregation in the urban spaces, or you have a lack of access to resources of the state, or you have unemployment and poverty rates way high as opposed to the media of the society, and etc. Okay, so these have social effects always, and to have social effects, you need institutions. Without institutions, there's no racism. Without having institutional racism, you see. So racism is always institution. And it's a structural superiority and inferiority along the line of the human. How do you mark that superiority and inferiority? Could be through color, could be through religion, ethnicity, in many ways. Okay. Now, what is the implication of this for the epistemological questions raised today? And that is that a lot of what we call social scientific theory, social theory, or critical theory in the westernized university, but also in the westernized left, is the social historical experience of this other in the zone of being. Okay? That's what we call social scientific theory, critical theory, etc. It's always the critical thought produced by the social historical experience of an oppressed other in the zone of being. That's what prevails. That's the hegemonic way of thinking in the westernized university, as I explained, and in the westernized left, because they reproduce the Eurocentric fundamentalism of the epistemic racism/sexism that I discussed before. And so, the pretension, and here is where we start beginning to have the problems, okay? The pretension, if people, like let's say, here you have Marxism, psychoanalysis, post-structuralism, many isms, okay, that have developed as critical theory inside the West, okay, based on the experience of what? Marxism, the European proletarian, as the experience of the European proletarian, but it's not the experience of labor elsewhere. It's the experience of the European proletarian, but it's not the experience of all proletarians in the world. Okay? Psychoanalysis is the experience of the Austrian middle classes. But it's not the experience of all the middle classes of the world. That's why the Oedipal complex is not universal. And that's developed by Fanon in his work Black Skin, White Mask, where he criticized psychoanalysis for pretending to be universal, and he shows how the Oedipal complex do not apply to black families in a white world. Okay? And also you have Ashish Nandi also has a book demonstrating how psychoanalysis do not work in India. Okay? Because there are other social structure, other historical experiences that you cannot apply concepts like that. Okay? Same thing for post-structuralism and another. Okay? Post-structuralism is the May 68 uprisings, that basically produced post-structuralism in the 70s. Okay, and it's based on a particular historical experience. Now, if they would tell me, well, you know what? I analyzed the condition of the European proletariat, and I don't pretend that my theory will exhaust all other experiences in the world. That's fine with me. You see? Or if Western feminists will tell me, I take into consideration only the situation of Western women, but I cannot pretend that my theories would be applicable to women oppressed in the zone of non-being, it's fine with me. But that's not how it comes out. And that's not the pretension. The pretension is similar to the knowledge of this I, this other pretends to be universal. And pretends that their theories are going to exhaust all the experiences in the world. And therefore, if you are a revolutionary in the global south, you have to be Marxist. And if you are a feminist in the global south, you have to be a Western feminist. Okay? And if you are and so on. Okay? So the pretension is that this should be applicable here too. Okay? This is the pretension. Right? But now this is a colonialism from the left. Okay? This is a colonialism from the left. Because it's reproducing the same thing that this I do, okay? But now from the left. The critical thought within the zone of being becoming now the universal paradigm, okay, through which you're going to produce critical thinking everywhere else. Okay? Now, there are people, male and women, producing critical thought from the social historical experience, okay, of people located in the zone of non-being. Like Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, no? The Aymara social scientist. Okay? Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, Sylvia Wynter, the Caribbean philosopher. Angela Davis, African-American philosopher. Okay? Enrique Dussel. Okay? Kwame Nkrumah in Africa. Steve Biko in Africa. You could go around the world and you could find a body of critical thinkers, okay, that are thinking and producing theory from the social historical experience, okay, of the other in the zone of non-being. Not the other in the zone of being. Look at these two others here, counterposed. We need to be very precise about, okay, from which other we're talking about. Because it's another here, but it's another here. You see? And so we need to be very precise here to see from which otherness are we thinking from, okay? Or are we taking seriously the knowledge, etc. Okay? So what happened here is that these thinkers, because of epistemic racism and sexism, they're invisibilized. They're not part of the canon or the conversation or part of the necessary readings in social science disciplines or necessary readings in the westernized left, be that feminist, socialist, whatever, okay? Queer, whatever. They're not part of the canon. They're completely invisibilized because they're inferiorized because of epistemic sexism and racism that is being reproduced from here too. Okay? So, there is a body of knowledge that is there, and you cannot say, oh, it doesn't exist. No, it doesn't exist for you, okay? Or it doesn't exist because you don't want to see it. but it exists. And we have plenty of thinkers, critical thinkers, in thinking from this social historical experience that are completely inferiorized relative to these others. Okay? So the question here is then, if they are inferiorized relative to these others, what is the concept here? Is this different or is this alterity? Okay? Now, here is where you have the concepts of philosopher of liberation, Enrique Gusso, where he says, in a universe of meaning, let's say this global system, okay? You have people who are critical thinkers from within this imperial universe of meaning, which are these others in the zone of being. Okay? But there are people who are critical thinkers in the exteriority, not from within the terms or the epistemologies of the West. This is an exteriority, but it's not an absolute exteriority. Nobody can claim that it's outside in an absolutist way. Because what I said before, everybody has been touched by this modern colonial world. Nobody can claim that it's in an absolute outside. Okay? What I'm talking about here is relative exteriority. Okay? Relative exteriority means that there are some people that have more exteriority in terms of subjectivity, epistemology, etc. than others. Okay? Because the colonial project was not fully successful in its epistemicide pretensions or epistemicide goals. It's not fully successful. There's still many epistemologies that survived the colonization, but survived in a very, how can I say, not in a pure way. Okay, it survived the colonization in a very messed up way, because the colonization, as I said, touched everybody. But that means that they have a foot inside, you see, of Eurocentrism, but they also have a foot outside of categories of knowledge that are not coming from a genealogy of thinking of the West. Okay? In the case of the Aymaras, they have a tradition of thinkers that come from a different genealogy of thought in terms of Islam or in terms of different tradition of thought in the world. You have different critical thinkers and genealogy of thought, okay, that is semi-autonomous from the West. It's not fully autonomous, but it's not exactly the West, because they still have categories of knowledge and conception that were not completely destroyed, that are there, okay? Reformulated, redefined, changed from what it was in the past, but it's still some exteriority there. I call it relative exteriority. That's how Enrique Dussel called it, okay? Now, I'm not an epistemic populist. I'm not saying that because you're black, indigenous, or whatever, Buddhist, now you're a critical thinker. It's not what I'm saying. Okay? I'm saying there are critical thinkers. Paying attention to the critical thinkers in this room. Maybe the Westernized university is not that happy. The architecture is rebelling. Anyway, so you have I'm talking about the critical thinkers. I'm not talking about anybody. Because the success of the system has been historically to make the people socially below to think epistemically like the people socially above. That's the success of the system. So the fact that a person can be from other, subaltern groups doesn't mean that epistemically speaking is thinking from that location critically. It doesn't mean he's a critical thinker. You need to, in a sense, what I'm calling for here is taking seriously the critical thinkers who are thinking from this other zone of the world, from the social historical experience of this zone, in which racial oppression aggravates the intersectionality of the oppressions, in which the way the system manages conflict is not through regulation emancipation, it's through violence and appropriation. And for that you require other categories of thought that you're not going to get in the critical thinking of the people in this zone. Because the people in this zone are theorizing, okay, the class oppression, gender oppression, all this oppression, but with racial privilege. That means that they're living the conflicts in a different form through regulation emancipation, which is different from the conflict lived through violence and appropriation. Okay? So now, here is where the concept of difference and alterity comes in. Because the concept of difference is a critique within. A critique within is a difference. Because you share the premises of Eurocentric thinking. And what you're doing is a critique, it's a Eurocentric critique of Eurocentrism, because you are criticizing Eurocentrism from within. See, and that's what Dussel calls a critique from difference. And he's saying the method for that, historically used, has been dialectics. Okay? Historically used as being dialectics as a method. Okay? Now, what he's saying is that the critique from this other zone, from the relative exteriority of the system, the people who have been exteriorized, is not anymore a critique from difference. That is a Eurocentric critique of Eurocentrism. It's not the critique that produced from here to this eye. It's now a critique from a different zone. It's a critique from this zone to this eye and to this other. And that's what he calls alterity, as opposed to a critique from difference. It's a critique from alterity because he's thinking from the relative exteriority, which means that is an epistemology that is not, you cannot call fully westernized. Okay? It's not a Eurocentric critique of Eurocentrism, it's not a critique from within, like someone inside criticizing the system. It's someone from the relative exteriority, the zone of non-being, now criticizing the system. And this relative exteriority implies an alterity. That's what he calls the alterity. That's the difference between difference and alterity. Okay? Where are you thinking from? Okay? Are you thinking from the critical thought produced from the zone of being, or are you thinking from the critical thought produced from the zone of non-being? This is a critique from difference, this is a critique from alterity. Okay? Now, alterity doesn't mean that there are people fully exterior. That's not the point. I'm insisting on this because in anthropology there's been a long debate about this. And I'm not claiming that there are people absolutely in an absolute exteriority. That is impossible today. After 500 years of European colonial expansion on the modern colonial world, we cannot make a claim like that. Because everybody has been touched by this. But not everybody has been touched in the same way. And that's why I'm claiming that there is a relative exteriority, you see, from here that is very different from here. You follow me here? So here is now the question. So you have several projects. Philosophy of liberation is saying, if you want to produce a radical critical thought, you have to depart from this relative exteriority. Because if you take as the point of departure this other here in the zone of being, or this, the critique from within, the problem with that is that these people are blind towards what is happening in this other side. Blind. Why are they blind? Because they have never theorized the question of how racism aggravates the intersectionality of oppressions. And they haven't theorized it, but it's not their problem. As simple as that. That was not Marx's problem. That was not Freud's problem. See, that was not Foucault's problem. Okay? That was not Derrida's problem. But that's the problem of Angela Davis. That's the problem of Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui. That's the problem of Sylvia Winter. That's the problem of Ali Shariati, an Islamic sociologist. That's the problem of many other people in the world. The problem of colonialism and racism. The problem of slavery and colonialism. Okay? This is the problem for them, and therefore they're forced to theorize that. As simple as that. It's not because there's anything essential to the human beings here as opposed to here. There's nothing essential here. These are structural locations, you see? And there's nothing automatic. Doesn't mean that because you're here, okay, because you're socially here, you're now producing decolonial thought. No. The success of the system, again, is to make the people here to think epistemically like the people above. The same way that doesn't mean, please listen to me, that because you are here, you cannot produce decolonial theory. You're able to produce decolonial theory. And I'll give us an example, Boaventura de Sousa Santos, sociology. Because he's calling for epistemology of the South. He's taking seriously this critical thought here. To produce then a sociology that breaks away from the sociology produced here. And Boaventura de Sousa Santos is a Portuguese Western sociologist. He's not Brazilian. I'm clarifying this, many people think he's Brazilian. He's not Brazilian, he's from Portugal. A European sociologist. But he's producing a decolonial social theory. How is he able to do that? Because he's mentioned, he's said many times, because he's taken very seriously the abyssal line, what he calls the abyssal line, that I would say is the same as the human line of Fanon, and he's taking very seriously the epistemology of the South, which are located here. Okay? He's taking this very seriously. So the point I'm trying to make, the fact that you are socially here doesn't mean you're unable to produce decolonial theory. The only possibility for you is colonial theory. That's a false assumption. That's a reductionism. That's a collapse between social location and epistemic location. You see? And the same thing, the fact that you're here doesn't mean that automatically now you're producing decolonial theory. Okay? But we cannot essentialize these things. So what I'm talking about is the critical thought of people located here who are producing knowledge, thinking in the social historical experience of people living here. That's the critical thought I'm capturing and saying we need to take that seriously. As seriously as we read Marx, Foucault, and Freud, and other people. And that you can do being here or being here. You don't have to be here to be able to do that. And the best demonstration, I would say, is Boaventura de Sousa Santos. That is showing us that possibility. And it's an invitation for producing decolonial thought and decolonial knowledge for everybody. All Europeans are able to do it if they take seriously this question and of the epistemology of where are you thinking from and where are you going, which are the authors you're going to take seriously as point of departure to do a critique. But if we continue reading as the only source of critical knowledge, Marx, Freud, Derrida, Foucault, Lacan, Gramsci, etc., then we're only again going to reproduce once again the epistemic sexism, racism, and calling. Because as good contributions you can find those authors, is still a limited critique because they are thinking as critical thinking from here. Okay? And there are things we can learn from them. I'm not an anti-European fundamentalist. Please. I'm calling for interepistemic dialogues. I'm calling from, instead of a universe of meaning, pluriverses. Calling for opening up the possibility of having interepistemic conversations between critical thinkers of different traditions, but looking at each other horizontally, face to face, as equals. And I don't mind a European man entering the conversation, be that Foucault, Gramsci, whoever it is, or the post-Foucauldian, whoever they are, as long as they enter the conversation as one more, not anymore at the center. They cannot be anymore the center, because if they become the center again, then we fall back in the same problem again. So I am inviting that conversation as long as they enter to the room in a humble way. And they assume a decolonial attitude, which means I'm one more, and I'm going to listen to what other people say, and I'm going to tell you what I think about this. As one more, without the pretension that this is the only game in town, which is what has happened in the last 500 years. It's still happening in the Westernized university, Westernized left. So I'm not an anti-European fundamentalist. Please, I'm saying this because every time I say it's so normal, so normalized, this idea of Eurocentric thinking and the racism, sexism, epistemology, and the privilege of the Western modified country, that when you question this, people, this is an anti-European fundamentalist. No, I'm anti-Eurocentric. I'm not anti-European. And Europeans can enter the conversation, but they have to enter as one more. They cannot enter at the center of the conversation, and they have to enter with an attitude that is a decolonial attitude of learning from others, listening to others, accepting the limits of their knowledge, because their knowledge has been produced from this location, and then opening up themselves to epistemologies of the South, which is what Boaventura is doing and inviting everybody to do. Okay? Now, you have so the thinking from this zone of, the critical thinking from this zone of non-being, or from this reality interiority, will be the alterity, and the method there that Dussel talks about is analectic as opposed to dialectics. Okay? Analectics, where he's talking about taking analogies of different epistemologies, one, and taking the rationality of the subjects located here as a form of rationality. So he's saying, we don't have to fall into this postmodernism where what is wrong is rationality. That's a Eurocentric critique of Eurocentrism. Because the fact that Western male rationality have failed, okay, and have become Eurocentric and have failed in this project, it have become very provincial kind of knowledge that is produced, disguised as universal, doesn't mean that now we throw away rationality. There are other forms of rationality, okay, coming from here and very diverse, okay, that are the rationality from alterity, okay, that produce other categories that are useful to solve some of the limits produced from here. For example, the concept of pluriversalism or transmodernity that you have discussed already, in the groups. Transmodernity, pluriversalism, as opposed to universal. Uni is one that defines for everybody. In this case, the Western man. Okay, we have criticized already that with Descartes. Okay, and that one is the only one that is the universal being. 6% of humanity. The rest are particularistic. 94% of humanity. Right. So this has failed. This is provincial. This is not leading us to anything except global nightmares from the right and the left. Okay? So we need to move to different categories. And these different categories are being offered and produced from this location. Like the concept of transmodernity, the concept of pluriversalism, Okay? There are different concepts being produced that can be useful for having this conversation. Now, pluriversalism, multiversalism, not everything goes. It's not a relativism. Okay? Because what is shared by the critical thought here is anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, anti-capital, anti-patriarchal. With that, you have a criteria of what is critical thinking. So there are people producing critical thought in relation to capitalism, imperialism, colonialism, and patriarchy in the world, but from Aymara point of view, or from Islamic point of view, the Islamic feminist, or from other perspectives. So I'm not romanticizing here the other, okay? I'm not saying everybody here is already decolonial, okay? I'm saying the critical thinkers from this location, okay, that are being invisibilized and inferiorized by this Eurocentric fundamentalism based on epistemic racism, sexism. And we need to, this is wasted knowledge and wasted experiences, like Boaventura will say, that we cannot waste. We need sociology of emergences, like he will say, to bring back those knowledges, okay, into the conversation. Because not because they are other, it's because they are important and useful for understanding what's going on in the world and how we go about transforming it. That's why they're very important. Okay? So methodologically speaking, if we now come from here and study the narrative of these people and do ethnography, and now study these others as objects of knowledge, then we become colonial anthropologists. Because you're going to be studying the other as an object of knowledge in which the categories of the anthropology are never contaminated by the critical knowledge of these people in the zone of being. You just study them to document what are they saying, okay? To write your paper or your dissertation or your book, okay? But you're not taking them as subjects that produce knowledge and theory. You're just taking them as subjects of knowledge. And that's the quintessential colonial epistemology. And that's colonial methodology. Now, if you want to stop being a colonial anthropologist and move in the direction of decolonial thought, like Boaventura and Sosa Sato have done, then you need a different methodology. And that methodology has to be to take seriously the critical thought produced from here, to criticize mainstream thought, to contaminate yourself and your own thought from that critical knowledge, and bring that to the conversation inside these walls. That's the decolonial term. So methodologically speaking, you have to depart from alterity, not from difference. You depart from alterity as a point of departure to do a radical critique to the mainstream hegemonic thought. And that's the decolonial methodology and decolonial term. The rest is just studying the other subject. And if you study the other subject, you became a colonial anthropologist. You see? To transform that, you will have to do something different. You will have to take seriously the critical thought coming from here, to contaminate yourself with that, and to question your own. You need some kind of reflexivity there, auto-reflexivity, in which you take those critical knowledges as a point of departure to do a radical critique to mainstream knowledge. That's the decolonial term, that's the decolonial methodology. And where you go for this, you go to the zones of non-being, the subjects producing critical thinking, not everybody. is people producing critical thinking, taking very seriously this question of the zone of non-being. People who are located there and producing critical thought from there. And you could learn from them, you know, which is one of the slogans of epistemology of the South, learning from the South. Okay? You can learn from them to then rethink the hegemonic Eurocentric categories. And to become then an ally of the liberation struggles happening here. To do that, you need to break away from what Huria Butelja, the leader of the indigenous of the Republic, called the white political field. I don't know if you understand what that means. The white political field, she used it in France, this concept, to talk about the spectrum of the political position that exists in the zone of being, from the extreme right to the extreme left. Passing through all the middle, that's a field that is a struggle, there are conflicts there, contradictions, but it's a field that share among themselves the blindness towards what is happening here and towards the epistemologies produced from here. So they produce absences in the knowledge they produce. This is the lemma, the sociology of absences of Boaventura. They produce absences, and one of those absences is that this knowledge becomes invisibilized, inferiorized, completely out of scope or of visibility. Okay? So to be able then to break, to do the colonial methodology and produce knowledge that is decolonial, you need then to break from the white political field, which means break from the epistemologies located in this field. And take them seriously and take sight. And here comes the politics. You have to take sides with the critical views coming from here. And these critical views are not just epistemological, they are political. So when I've been using here epistemology, I'm talking about the political, ethical, epistemic perspective of subjects here, whose knowledge is produced, okay, within a political project of liberation. And for that, it's inevitable that you have to take side, because nobody is neutral. There's no neutrality here. Either you're thinking from this side or you're thinking from this side. There's no middle way here. Okay? And if you're thinking from this side, you're taking a political stand. And if you're thinking from this one, you're taking also a political stand. So you're not outside politics in this. And the pretension that objectivity is equivalent to neutrality is one of these Eurocentric mythologies of the God I view. Because if we're humans, we are always limited and we're always thinking from a place, and from a situation, and from a location, and from a body. And therefore, we're never completely neutral. So this is where Boaventura says we could be objective at the same time that we're partial. That is, we can be objective without being neutral, taking side in the struggles. And there's no way out from this. Because even if you say, no, I'm not political, I don't want to take side, I want to be a serious sociologist or a serious anthropologist beyond politics, okay? You're going to take then the point of view within the white political field. Either you like it or not. Because you're going to be thinking from within the Western eye view. So there's no way out of this. So you have to decide where you're standing here. Because anybody who claims that their knowledge is apolitical or outside politics is really reproducing one of these mythologies of westernized modernity. that I've been criticizing early on. Because nobody have got idea. Everybody we're all human beings, limited, with limitations, located, etc. And therefore our knowledge is always situated. And therefore we're taking sides always. So decolonial methodology implies a politics too. You have to take sides. Which side are you in? You cannot say, put the hat of anthropology and go around the world with the hat of anthropology, and look at people as if you were neutral relative to their conflicts. You're not neutral. You're taking a stand in whatever you say or do, with one side or the other. And the point here is to be honest about this, and then come up with which side you are in. And this is the point made by Boaventura. There's no objectivity equivalent to neutrality. We could be objective at the same time, or we take side. Okay? And we take side in this case with the global south. Okay? And the point he's making is objectivity here means you need to present evidence of what you're trying to say. That's it. Doesn't mean that you claim neutrality. It means you're going to present evidence to sustain your point. But then to jump from there to say I'm neutral, and this is neutral knowledge on bias, okay, then there is the jump, towards the hell of Western-centric epistemic racism and sexism. Okay, so anyway, I'll stop here, and we can debate these things. I'm sure there are many critical comments.